Episode 5 of Life on Earth is called Conquest of the Waters, and it's all about fish. So this episode opens up with, like we've seen in other episodes, a montage of various different types of fish. We really get to see the diversity of them, and they do highlight that. Obviously, the diversity of fish is something that's going to be heavily commented on throughout the episode, and they begin by looking at the origins of fish, or the possible origins. They look at sea squirts, which is a very interesting animal. It's a bit like a jelly. They highlight that it's got this little rod inside, which is kind of a preamble to the very first backbones, and the very first fish actually looked a little bit like that, although they do look a lot more like fish to me, at least from looking at the fossils. And then we move on to talk about the most primitive types of fish, the jawless fish. So there's three main types we look at. Those are the lancelets, the lampreys, and the hagfish. The main thing about them is that the fact that they're not really true fish, they've not got any bones, they've just got this cord that runs through their body, which is, basically the first backbone, essentially. And apart from having no jaws, they've got something in common, and that is the way they move. So they move in a very defined S shape. They've all got very long bodies, almost a bit like a snake almost, and they basically wriggle through the water in that S shape. Now that S shape is highlighted throughout the rest of the episode. It's kind of the template to the way that most fish move, but it's most obvious in these ones, and they're kind of the forerunners for other fish. And to look at what a lot of prehistoric fish would have looked like, they go to this ancient seabed in Australia, which is actually in the desert. It's weird because it just looks like a load of rocks. You would just assume it's part of the desert, but it's weird to think that this was actually underwater at some point. And the rock formations weren't carved by the wind, they were actually carved by the ocean currents. Mental. And then we move on to talk about the cartilaginous fish, the sharks. That is highlighted through the introduction of jaws. So jaws obviously are a major point of any vertebrate, and they evolved in fish obviously. And talking about jaws is a great way to springboard into sharks. Obviously it's probably one of the most obvious springboards in the episode, if not the series. But the sharks are really interesting. They do a good job of showing you how intimidating they are. And I will say, a lot of the footage in this episode I think was taken from aquariums. A lot of the shark stuff was definitely taken there. It's quite obvious. But they do a good job of showing you the shark body plan. The fact that they've actually got skeletons shows that they're a lot more bulky than these primitive jawless fish, and they don't move in quite the same way. Basically all the propulsion is in the back end of the body, and that's pretty much the case for the vast majority of fish. They've also got fins on either side to stabilise them, but obviously they can't move them like a lot of bony fish do. And most notably, sharks do not have a swim bladder, so they have to keep moving to propel themselves through the water, and the inconveniences of that are highlighted. And it's actually shown that a lot of cartilaginous fish actually allow themselves to sink to the bottom and just live in the bottom. A lot of carpet sharks do that, sawfish do that, actually a lot of rays do that. The rays are actually highlighted as being pretty much experts in that. In fact, their bodies have basically become flattened out, and their fins have become so wide that they basically ripple along the bottom of the ocean floor, and they don't really need to propel themselves through the water that much. They also highlight filter feeding, how filter feeding can actually allow you to get really big. Basking sharks are a good view of that. And the rest of the episode looks at the bony fish. So the bony fish are obviously the most abundant types of fish in the world, specifically ray-finned fish, which is basically all the rest of the episode deals with. We talk about some of the most primitive versions of that, things like paddlefish and sturgeon, which actually are pretty primitive. I've never really thought too much about sturgeon and how weird they are, but the fact that they've got this really hard outer casing is really interesting. I think they're just really weird animals, and just their skin, the way they look is pretty weird. They've got a pretty weird face, to be honest with you. Then we talk about swim bladders. So swim bladders may be one of the most important things to have evolved in vertebrates. It's essentially a big sack of air which allows the fish to stay buoyant, which is part of the reason that bony fish are so successful. The fact that they're not restricted to a certain type of movement means that they've been able to branch out into various different shapes and sizes. One of the main ones we look at are pike in the freshwater. There's a pretty good extended sequence of pike hunting roach, which is great. They highlight how, unlike sharks, bony fish are able to move their fins a lot to actually stabilise them in the water. Pike are shown to do that to great effect when hunting. It's a really good sequence. It's actually one of the better actual sequences in the episode, I would say. There's not a lot of behavioural sequences in this series, really. This is one of the few, and it is quite good. I quite like it. There's this really fun sequence of Attenborough in the surf, just chatting, and he looks quite funny because he's just in his trunks, and then he just jumps into the water. It's almost like a really weird, I don't know, surfer flick moment. I found it quite amusing. And from there we talk about reef fish. So reef fish are obviously among the most physically diverse fish. Actually, most reef fish, despite being very diverse, actually all have a similar body plan. Despite their diversities, they're all pretty compact. Because they live in this really crowded world, it's not in their interest to be really long. Most reef fish are quite small. I'd never really given that much thought before. I'd never really noticed that before, but I guess it's actually pretty obvious now that it's pointed out. Various reef fish are highlighted, things like parrotfish, angelfish, pufferfish, and they're all pretty unique. They all have a pretty unique niche on the reef, but their body is kind of similar. And colour is highlighted as being very important to reef fish. A lot of bony fish do see in colour, unlike sharks and rays, which are pretty drab. And those colours are very important for identifying different species because there's so many species of fish on the reef. And as I say, they all have pretty similar body plans. Colour is the main distinguishing feature between them. That was really interesting. I hadn't really given that much thought. And then we move on to shoalfish that live off the reef, have a very different body plan. They're a lot longer, they're a lot more streamlined because they're built for speed. It's in their best interest to be fast. And the predators that live there are also pretty fast. They all have a pretty similar body shape. That body plan is pretty successful for life in the open ocean, so most of them do it. I highlight how a lot of smaller fish band together in shoals because that's their main source of defence. That's really interesting. And look at how some bony fish have actually abandoned the swim bladder altogether to become bottom dwellers. Things like flatfish, because we look at the life cycle of flatfish, we see them from eggs to fry, and they've got that kind of classic fish shape. But as they get older, their eyes pretty much become lopsided, and one of them actually rotates to be on the top of its head. It's really weird. I never really thought about that, that's really interesting. We see how most of the bottom fish are actually predators, things like anglerfish, stonefish. Because they're not using their fins for much, they've evolved into these sharp, barbed structures. They're very good for defence, and some actually contain venom. And from there we move on to talk about deep sea fish. So Ambra does a good job of highlighting the submersibles. Obviously this was something that hadn't really been seen before, and we do show some deep sea fish, things like anglerfish. There's also things that aren't deep sea fish at all, like shrimps and prawns. But I guess because we'd never seen deep sea animals before this point, they probably just, used it as an excuse to show whatever they could. Like they do every time they do show deep sea fish, it's really an excuse to show whatever they can, because it's always new and it's always pretty cool. The episode has obviously been massively surpassed by a lot of different series, but it was the first one to do it, so it's interesting. They utilise a lot of stills for this bit of the episode, and that's fine. Again, it's something that probably wouldn't fly today, but, it's interesting for the time. It is quite good. And then we talk about fish that live in more extreme environments. Amber does this good job of wandering through this volcanic lake. It's actually really funny when he dips his toes in it because he's actually struggling to speak through it. It is actually quite funny. And he points out how there's fish even here in this extremely salty, extremely hot body of water. And the reverse of that, there's fish that live at the poles that have got antifreeze in their blood. That's interesting as well. I knew about that, but it was good to highlight it. And it was actually really important to highlight it, I think. And we move on to talk about the king of the fish, and that is the salmon. The salmon sequence is pretty good, actually. I think it's a good way of sort of closing the episode out. Salmon, because that's probably the most famous fish outside of sharks for us. They show the really epic story of the salmon travelling upstream, jumping up waterfalls, and making their way to the stream. So they were born, we see them mating, and we eventually see them obviously rotting when they die. It's pretty horrific, but I think it was a really good, epic way of closing out the episode, because that is probably the most famous fish story that we're aware of, I think. I think salmon are, pretty impressive and pretty important for that reason. And the last bit of footage we get is a really minor bit, but does a good job of leading into the next episode, and that is the walking catfish. So it basically walks on the land to, find other bodies of water. But it's a very good segue into the next episode, which will talk about fish that made it onto dry land and amphibians. So I think that was a pretty good way of closing out the episode. So yeah, this episode is pretty good. I actually quite liked it. Fish are probably the least interesting group of animals for me, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. So this episode could have again been a bit boring, but it wasn't. I really liked it. Did a good job of showing you the sheer diversity of fish, and I think every type of fish were covered. I think that was really good, and yeah, it was just very interesting, like every other episode in the series. So yeah, it's really good. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, what you think of this episode. Let me know, and I'll be doing the next one next week, which is all about amphibians. So look forward to that. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Or don't if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time. And goodbye.